Why should we consider the Quran to be a better historical record when it's so much later than these New Testament accounts?
Well, the Quran does not claim to be a better historical record. The Quran claims to reaffirm that teaching which is there in the earlier historical record, namely the Gospels themselves. And it calls upon the people of the Gospel to judge by what God has revealed in the Gospels. And when we look at the Gospels, we see that Jesus throughout was referring to himself as the Son of Man, which means a human being, that he had human limitations. He did not know everything. He said of that day and hour no man knows, not even the Son, but the Father only. He said, I can of myself do nothing. I do only as the Father has commanded me. Throughout, Jesus is deferring to God, and in fact he falls in his face and he prays to God. All of these are human attributes which the Quran affirms as clear evidence that Jesus was a prophet, he was a human servant and messenger of God.
Okay, Michael, those are some very good points that the Quran talks about and refers to in the Gospels. How do you look at the matter?
Well, it's how Christians have looked at it from the very beginning, that Jesus had two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. So simply, he had these limitations in his human nature while not in his divine nature.
You must have it such that Jesus is completely God and completely man at the same time. That is like saying that something is a square circle. You cannot be both, because to be human means to have limitations. To be divine means to have none. You cannot be limited and unlimited at the same time, unless you're schizophrenic, in which you have two different personalities here.
Okay, Michael, is Jesus schizophrenic? Let's answer that question.
Well, no. I mean, he was completely human in his human nature, and he was completely divine in his divine nature, and this is pretty clear throughout the New Testament. But when we come to the Quran, what we find is a Jesus that is quite different than what we find in the New Testament. It's a Jesus who comes out of the womb speaking and preaching. It's a Jesus who's part of a Trinity that includes the Father, Son, and Mary. It's a Jesus that we find in the Gnostic Gospel.
I think you have misunderstood the Quran here, because the Quran does not say that Jesus is part of a Trinity that involves God, Mary, and Jesus. The Quran refutes the belief of those...
Well, that might be a certain interpretation of it, but...
The Quran refutes the belief of those who claim this. But what the Quran shows clearly is that Jesus cannot be part of a Trinity, because no such thing as a Trinity exists. That God is one throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament. The word Trinity does not exist in the Bible. This is a later idea.
Well, neither does theology, Shabir, but we both believe theology is real. I mean, listen, what we have of the Quran is this. We've got a book that's written 600 years after Jesus, fifth-hand source at best. It's written in a different country, a different culture, in a different language in which Jesus lived.
Yeah, Mike, but you're missing the point, because one doesn't need the Quran to affirm that Jesus is a human being and a prophet. The Quran, by affirming that Jesus is a prophet, is not saying something new than what Christians already believe, because the Gospels show that he's a prophet, and Christians, despite believing that Jesus is God, also affirm that he's a prophet. So on that, Christians will agree with the Quran.
Shabir, let me ask this then. Where did this idea that Jesus is God come from?
Well, the idea that Jesus is God is something that evolved over time. We can see in the pages of the New Testament itself and Acts of the Apostles that people very easily in the Greco-Roman world took people for gods.
Shabir, I want to tell you, I've written a 300-page book on the evidence that convinced me as an atheist that Jesus did claim to be the Son of God, and he proved it by returning from the dead. And so my last question to you, and we just have a moment, is what would you say to Christians like me who are absolutely convinced by the evidence that the evidence supports those claims?
I would say that you have to start by looking at the logical problems with claiming that Jesus is God, and then interpret the scriptures in a reasonable way that does not give rise to these logical problems. Okay. To say that he was God and man at the same time is logically self-contradictory. To say he's one of a Trinity is also to introduce another logical contradiction.